On a cold night in the quiet town of Mill Creek, a shocking affair between a Christian woman and her neighbor's Muslim son spiraled out of control, ending in a gruesome murder. What seemed like a forbidden romance turned deadly when her husband took matters into his own hands. This is the story of Zain Omar, a 20-year-old boy whose life ended tragically in the wake of an affair he never saw coming. In the quiet town of Mill Creek, Zain Omar stood out for his dedication to both his family and his faith. His life had been defined by the expectations placed upon him since his family emigrated from Lebanon. Raised under the watchful eyes of his parents, Ali and Amira, Zain's upbringing was steeped in tradition and strict adherence to Islamic teachings. From a young age, he learned the value of hard work, helping his parents run their small halal grocery store. But beneath his diligent exterior, Zain harbored feelings of isolation and confusion. As one of the few Muslims in a predominantly Christian community, he often felt like an outsider. Zain's loneliness was something he rarely spoke about, not even to his closest friends. It wasn't just the religious and cultural differences that made him feel distant. There was something deeper, an emotional void he couldn't quite explain. Though he was known for his politeness and strong work ethic, Zain struggled with feelings of misunderstanding, especially when it came to women. He had been raised to respect boundaries and avoid relationships outside his faith, yet his heart ached for connection. At 20, Zain was caught between the expectations of his parents and his personal desire to explore a world that seemed beyond his reach. Across the street from Zain lived the Harrisons, a family Zain had known for years but had never grown close to. Sarah Harrison, a woman twice Zain's age, was well known for her community involvement. On the outside, she appeared to be a picture-perfect Christian wife. She spent her days volunteering at the church, organizing charity events, and offering a helping hand to neighbors in need. But as the years passed, Sarah's life became defined by the emotional absence of her husband, Michael. Though successful in his career, Michael had become increasingly detached from their marriage, spending long hours at work, leaving Sarah to navigate her days in loneliness. Sarah, now 42, often reflected on her younger years when she and Michael had shared a deep love. Those days had faded, replaced by routine and cold silences. She had reached a point where she felt invisible. Despite her outward appearance of having it all, Sarah was starved for affection. The life she had built felt empty, her charitable works only distracting her from the gaping hole in her marriage. The attention she craved seemed like a distant memory, something she feared she would never feel again. When Zain and Sarah crossed paths during a community outreach program in January of 2011, it seemed like a chance encounter. They hadn't spoken much before, but on that day, their conversations flowed easily. At first, it was all innocent. Sarah offered Zain advice on navigating adulthood, sharing wisdom about life's challenges. He listened, intrigued by her confidence and poise. For Zain, Sarah represented something new, a person outside of his usual world who took an interest in him, who saw him as more than just the son of a Muslim grocer. As they spoke, Sarah found herself drawn to Zain's quiet strength and vulnerability, feelings she hadn't experienced in years. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. They would talk after church events or exchange brief words when they crossed paths in the neighborhood. What began as innocent conversations soon turned into something more. Both Zane and Sarah felt an unspoken connection growing between them, one they didn't dare acknowledge at first. But Sarah, desperate for the attention she lacked at home, found herself yearning for more. And Zane, despite knowing the affair would go against everything he had been taught, was captivated by Sarah's warmth and the sense of being understood in a way he had never felt before. Things finally fell apart on March 12, 2011, when Zane's parents returned home to find their son murdered in cold blood. The police were called, and an investigation began immediately. The community was stunned. How could such a brutal crime happen in their peaceful town? Looking back to how this came about. By mid-February 2011, the secret meetings of Zane and Sarah became more intense. They began communicating in private, exchanging messages through burner phones to avoid suspicion. They found secluded places to meet, and their relationship quickly became physical. It was a whirlwind of passion that neither had anticipated, and both were swept up in the thrill of their secret. However, as their affair deepened, so did the risks they were taking. Sarah became more reckless, spending nights out longer than she could explain to Michael, and Zane started distancing himself from his family, avoiding his father's watchful gaze. The weight of their secret grew heavier by the day, yet they couldn't bring themselves to stop. Each meeting felt like an escape from the harsh realities of their lives, but they were unaware of the consequences looming just ahead. In early March 2011, Michael's suspicions began to intensify. He had always trusted Sarah, but lately, her behavior seemed off. She was often distracted, and her absences became harder to ignore. On March 3rd, while Sarah was in the shower, Michael accidentally came across an anonymous text on her phone. The message wasn't explicit, but it was enough to raise alarms. He began piecing together her late-night walks and unexplainable absences, but instead of confronting her, Michael decided to keep quiet, determined to gather more information. At the same time, Zane's father, Ali, began noticing a change in his son's behavior. Zane, once the reliable worker at their grocery store, had been neglecting his duties, often disappearing without explanation. Ali sensed that something was wrong. Though he couldn't pinpoint what, his instincts told him that Zane was drifting away from the family, and it worried him deeply. He warned Zane, in his own way, about getting too close to people outside their faith, sensing that trouble was brewing in ways that neither of them could foresee. As the affair continued, both Sarah and Zane knew they were playing with fire. They began to feel the walls closing in on them. Sarah was losing control over the situation, and Zane felt increasingly torn between the life he had known and the dangerous path he was now on. But despite the fear and the risk, neither could walk away. The thrill of their forbidden love overshadowed the looming consequences, and it felt as though the world they had built in secret was about to come crashing down. By early March, the tension in the Harrison household had become palpable. Michael had grown increasingly suspicious of Sarah's late-night absences and her distracted demeanor. His once trusting nature had eroded, replaced by a growing sense of betrayal that gnawed at him day and night. On the evening of March 9th, 2011, after days of silent observation, Michael finally confronted Sarah about her behavior. He had found enough subtle clues, missed dinners, unexplained outings, and that anonymous text message on her phone to fuel his anger. As he stood in their dimly lit kitchen, Sarah attempted to deny everything, but her voice wavered. Her lies, once carefully crafted, now crumbled under the weight of Michael's cold gaze. Though Sarah tried to salvage the situation, the damage had already been done. In her panic, she stammered through her explanations, but Michael had already made up his mind. The rage he had been suppressing for weeks began to boil over, and his suspicions crystallized into something more dangerous. His wife was having an affair. Michael couldn't let go of the images swirling in his mind. Images he had created of Sarah with another man. His thoughts raced uncontrollably, and with every denial, he grew more certain that the betrayal was real. The next morning, March 10th, 2011, Michael decided to take matters into his own hands. He quietly followed Sarah, who left the house just after noon, heading to a place he had never seen her visit before. He kept his distance, staying just far enough behind so as not to be noticed. Sarah led him to a secluded area behind the local mosque, a place he hadn't imagined she would ever go. Hidden among the trees, Michael watched in horror as she met a young man. He immediately recognized Zain Omar, the boy who lived across the street, the boy he had seen grow up in their neighborhood. From the shadows, Michael watched them embrace, and all the restraint he had clung to for weeks shattered in an instant. The sight of Sarah in Zain's arms filled him with a jealousy so blinding, so overwhelming, that he could hardly think. In that moment, the quiet, calculated businessman was gone. He was consumed by a need for vengeance, for justice, for something that would stop the pain coursing through him. By the time the sun had set that night, Michael's mind had been made up. He knew what he had to do. Around 11 p.m., after hours of seething in their darkened living room, he slipped out of the house, leaving Sarah asleep upstairs. He walked across the street, his hands trembling as he gripped a kitchen knife. It wasn't the premeditated act of a cold-blooded killer, but the impulsive decision of a man who felt like everything had been taken from him. He was acting on pure emotion, on an impulse he could no longer control. Zain's parents had left town earlier that week to visit family, so the house was quiet. Michael entered through the unlocked back door, stepping into the darkened kitchen. The air was still, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. His footsteps echoed in his own ears as he moved deeper into the house, his heart racing. Zain, unaware of the impending danger, was in the living room, perhaps relaxing after another secret meeting with Sarah. When Michael appeared, Zain stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. The two men exchanged heated words, though neither could truly hear the other over the thunderous pounding in their chests. Michael's accusations spilled out, disjointed and frantic, while Zain tried to calm the situation, explaining himself in the only way he knew how. But their words fell on deaf ears. Michael wasn't looking for understanding. He wasn't there for explanations. What followed was chaos. The argument quickly escalated, and in a violent rage, Michael lunged at Zain, the knife flashing in the dim light. The struggle was brief, but brutal. Zain tried to defend himself, but Michael was too far gone, his vision clouded by anger. He struck again and again, each stab deeper than the last, until Zain's body collapsed onto the cold floor, blood pooling around him. The once peaceful home was now a scene of unimaginable horror. It wasn't until the silence settled back over the house that Michael realized what he had done. He stood over Zane's lifeless body, the knife still in his hand, blood dripping onto the floor. Time seemed to slow down, and for a moment, Michael's mind went blank. The reality of the situation hadn't yet caught up with him. He stared down at Zane, a boy he had once thought of as harmless, and now he was dead at his feet. Without thinking, Michael dropped the knife beside Zane's body and fled the house, his heart pounding in his chest as he crossed the street back to his own home. He didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to wipe the blood from his hands. All he knew was that he needed to get away, to put as much distance between himself and what he had done as possible. As he reached his front door, the realization of his actions hit him like a wave. He had just killed a man. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he washed the blood from them in the kitchen sink, the water turning a sickening shade of red. He glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight on March 11th, 2011. There was no going back now. That night, Michael lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Sarah slept soundly beside him, unaware of the horror that had unfolded just across the street. The weight of what he had is pressed down on him, suffocating him in the darkness. He had acted on pure rage, and now there was no undoing it. Zane was dead, and soon the truth would come to light. But for now, in the quiet of his own home, Michael tried to convince himself that he had done what was necessary. He had protected his marriage, his pride, his reputation. He had done what he thought was right, even if it was wrong. And as the minutes ticked by, he wondered how long he could keep the truth hidden. By the morning of March 12, 2011, the quiet streets of Mill Creek would never be the same. The air was unusually still as Ali and Amira Omar returned home from visiting family, unaware of the tragedy waiting for them. As soon as they stepped through the door, something felt wrong. The house was eerily silent, with no sign of their son, Zane, who was always there to greet them. Ali called out to him, but no answer came. It was Amira who found him first. The sight was too much to bear. Zane, their beloved son, lay cold and lifeless in the living room, his blood staining the floor. His body, once full of life, was now broken, taken by violence they could not yet comprehend. Amira's scream pierced the stillness of the morning, a cry that would haunt Ali for the rest of his life. In the moments that followed, their lives would be forever shattered. They had lost their son in the most horrific way imaginable. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights breaking the calm of the neighborhood. Officers entered the house, their faces hardened from years of experience, but even they were shocked by the brutality of the crime. A young man, just 20 years old, had been savagely murdered in what should have been the safety of his own home. The investigation began immediately, with detectives combing through the house for clues. It didn't take long for them to realize that this was no random act of violence. This murder was personal. By March 15th, the investigation had turned its focus to the Harrisons. As detectives scoured through Zane's phone records, they discovered a troubling link. Sarah Harrison's number appeared far too often. Sarah and her husband, Michael, were brought in for questioning, and the facade they had carefully maintained for so long began to crack. At first, Sarah denied everything. She portrayed herself as a faithful Christian wife, doing her best to help a troubled young man in the community. But under the pressure of the interrogation, her story faltered. The investigators noticed her nervousness, the way her hands shook when they asked about her relationship with Zane. Though she tried to remain composed, the guilt was written all over her face. Michael's alibi was even weaker. He claimed to have been working late the night of the murder, but the details were vague. His story filled with inconsistencies. As the detectives pressed him for more information, they sensed his growing unease. There was something he wasn't telling them, something dark that he was desperately trying to hide. By March 18th, the full extent of the affair between Sarah and Zane had been uncovered. The detectives pieced together the truth. A forbidden relationship that had been kept secret for months, now exposed for the entire town to see. The community, once so tightly knit, was shaken to its core. Sarah Harrison, a devout Christian woman, had been carrying on an affair with Zane Omar, a young Muslim boy from across the street. It was a scandal that no one could have predicted. Whispers spread like wildfire. How could this happen in such a conservative town? The betrayal was felt by everyone, friends, neighbors, and even the churchgoers who had always looked up to Sarah for her charitable work. Sarah became the subject of vicious gossip, and the town that once adored her now turned its back. The affair was all anyone could talk about, and Sarah's reputation crumbled under the weight of the revelations. Meanwhile, Zain's family struggled to cope with a double blow of their son's murder and the shame of the affair. Ali, a proud man who had always worked hard to provide for his family, blamed himself for not protecting his son. He replayed the weeks leading up to the murder over and over in his mind, questioning every interaction with Zane, wondering what he had missed. If only he had been more attentive, more vigilant, perhaps he could have stopped this from happening. Amira, already devastated by the loss of her only child, was now forced to reckon with the knowledge that her son had been involved in an affair that went against everything they had taught him. The betrayal cut deep. She had always believed Zaina to be a good boy, respectful of their faith and traditions. Now she was left to grapple with the fact that he had been living a secret life, one that had ultimately led to his death. On March 25th, the investigation took a significant turn. Forensic analysis had uncovered fingerprints on the knife left at the scene, and the results pointed directly to Michael Harrison. It was the final piece of evidence that the detectives needed. With Michael's weak alibi and the mounting physical evidence, it was clear who had killed Zane. The arrest came just 3 days later, on March 28th. The police arrived at the Harrison home in the early morning hours, much like the day Zane's body had been discovered. Michael, looking weary and defeated, did not resist as he was handcuffed and led away. Sarah watched from the doorway, her face pale, knowing that this was the end of everything. Her marriage, her reputation, her life as she knew it, all were destroyed. As the investigation unfolded, the true extent of Sarah's involvement became the subject of intense scrutiny. Though she was not directly implicated in the murder, the town could not ignore her role in the events that had led to Zane's death. Friends and neighbors who had once admired her now treated her with disgust. She became a pariah in her own community, shunned by those she had once considered allies. Michael, on the other hand, faced the full weight of the law. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and it was only a matter of time before he was convicted of murder. As the trial approached, his once confident demeanor was replaced by a sense of resignation. He knew there would be no redemption for him. Zayn's parents, Ali and Amira, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Ali was consumed by guilt, believing that if he had only paid closer attention to his son, things might have turned out differently. Amira, heartbroken by both the loss of her son and the revelations about his affair, found little comfort in the justice system. She had lost her only child, and no prison sentence could bring him back. The trial began in early 2012, with the whole town watching closely. Michael Harrison stood accused of first-degree murder, and the prosecution wasted no time in presenting the damning evidence against him. The affair, the confrontation, the fingerprints on the knife, it was all laid bare for the jury to see. Sarah's involvement in the affair was also brought to light, though she faced no legal consequences for her actions. In the courtroom, the emotional toll on all involved was clear. Zayn's parents sat quietly, holding each other's hands, their grief etched into their faces. Sarah, though not on trial, was present every day, her eyes empty as she watched the proceedings unfold. She knew the affair had destroyed everything she had once valued, and now she was left with nothing but the guilt of her choices. On the final day of the trial, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that brought little comfort to anyone. Zayn was still gone, and no amount of punishment could change that. In the months that followed, the town of Mill Creek slowly began to move on, but the scars remained. Zayn's murder had left a permanent mark on the community, and the memory of the affair lingered in the minds of those who had once considered themselves friends of the Harrisons. Sarah, though spared from legal punishment, faced a different kind of sentence. She was ostracized by the community, her reputation forever tarnished. She lived in the shadow of her choices, wondering if the affair had been worth the cost. As she visited Michael in prison, the question lingered in her mind. Was this the life she had wanted? In the end, no one truly won. Zayn was dead, Michael was imprisoned, and Sarah was left to live with the guilt and the destruction she had helped to cause. This sort of ending makes each and every one of us to ponder. When faith, love, and betrayal collide, who truly deserves to be punished? Check out other similar cases, especially this case where a Muslim wife's secret affair with husband's cousin